Hello and welcome to the Green Truth podcast by TiiQu, your go-to destination for insightful conversations on sustainability. We're committed to delving into diverse perspectives on environmental issues, guided by the belief that embracing truth empowers us to create a better world for generations to come. Today, Laura is joined by Michael Stanley-Jones, an advisor on the circular economy, as well as an advisor to the United Nations Environment Management Group.
Michael, thank you very much for being with us. Can you introduce yourself to our audience, please?
Thank you, Laura. I'm pleased to join you and Green Truth. I'm Michael Stanley-Jones, originally from San Francisco, California. I reside in Czechia, and I support a number of global and regional initiatives and some community-based initiatives in the broad field of sustainability. I'm a former United Nations officer. I served with the Economic Commission for Europe in the Secretariat of the Aarhus Convention, which is the leading environmental democracy treaty in the aughties, in the early part of this century. And later I joined the United Nations Environment Program in the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions. Those are the three leading conventions on hazardous chemicals and wastes. And still later, I moved to Nairobi, where UN Environment Program is headquartered, and joined the Poverty Environment Initiative, a joint initiative working in over 30 developing countries around the world of the United Nations Development Program and UNEP, United Nations Environment Program. Since returning to Europe, I've rejoined UNEP as a communications consultant, supporting the UN Environment Management Group. And I'm lastly senior advisor to the Circular Research Foundation based in the Salento region in southern Italy.
So, Michael, thank you for your introduction. So let's start with something that is very consumeristic, the fashion industry. Can you elaborate on your understanding of sustainability consciousness? How do you define it, and what aspects do you think it includes?
I have to say, I backed into the issue of fashion and sustainable development through my work with the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions. We had launched an international public awareness campaign called Safe Planet, the United Nations Campaign for Responsibility on Hazardous Chemicals and Wastes. And one of the flagships of this campaign was to work on microplastic pollution in the marine environment. Microplastics are the breakdown of large plastic items and the direct discharge of microfibers coming principally from clothing. Also, microfibers come from other products like car tires or automobile tires.
Sure.
But sustainability, the issues were not so much originally that the plastic was a hazard, but that it was a conveyor belt for other hazardous substances, particularly persistent organic pollutants and pesticides, which cling to the microplastics and can be ingested, inhaled, entering the human body, and through further breakdown can become nanoplastics, which can actually travel through the walls of our cells. And so this is an emerging area of serious concern to global health, because plastic pollution is everywhere. Microplastics are found in the air, they're found in the water, they're found in drinking water, groundwater, in marine environments, in marine organisms, in fish, and on and on and on. And so it's a serious question about whether this is a hazard to our health. And as I was working on Safe Planet campaign, I learned about the source of much of the microplastic pollution, about 14%. One study in the marine environment actually comes from the clothing we wear, from apparel. And I had no idea. I hadn't realized that currently almost 2/3 of all textiles manufactured globally are made of polyester. And that is synthetic material. It's derived from oil, from petroleum, and it's it's grown as a share of the global clothing market during our own lifetimes. Coupled with this, and very strongly related to sustainability, is the phenomenon of fast fashion. This is people buying cheap clothing, wearing it less often, throwing it away, and then running out and buying a new set of clothes. The fashion waste issue is just enormous, and it has a transboundary element. This is the subject of the Basel Convention, the control of transboundary movement of hazardous waste, in that a lot of this clothing ends up in countries that can't manage their waste stream. A lot of it ends up in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. And so there's this knot of issues about overconsumption of textiles, the production of textiles with materials that are not sustainable, which absorb other pollutants like persistent organic pollutants when they break down into micro and nanoplastics. These concerns came together about 10 years ago for me. And out of a dialogue we started in-house between a dozen or so of us at the UN Environment Program, we supported the launch of the United Nations Alliance for Sustainable Fashion. So this was an interagency effort to create a kind of one-stop shop within the UN family of where we could get authoritative information, green truth, if you will, about fashion and fashion waste, about overconsumption and overproduction of apparel.
How do you convince people not to use plastic-based clothes?
It's,
Everything is plastic.
well, not everything. There are sustainable fibers, fortunately, but even some natural fibers, principally cotton, which is ubiquitous in the fashion industry
Yeah.
as well, has itself an enormous environmental footprint. The water it consumes, the pesticides used to raise cotton, the conditions under which cotton is harvested. There's enormous range of impacts. So first of all, sustainability is not only about the environmental dimension. Sustainable development has three dimensions. It's tri-cornered, and that includes social dimension, which goes to issues like, are we producing clothing in ways that respect the human rights and workers' rights? For example, if child labor is being used to harvest cotton, that's a violation of a child's right. If wages being paid are below living wage for textile workers, principally women, that's also a violation of human rights. So that's another social component of sustainability. And then there's an economic sustainability as well. If we are going to transition away from synthetic clothing, that is oil-derived fiber, synthetics, polyester, nylon, etc., to more sustainable products, how will this affect the lives of workers and entire countries that depend on the export of currently low cost apparel? So there's an economic dimension, a social justice dimension, where advocates of sustainability are investing in what they call a just transition, what we call a just transition to a more sustainable market. Your question, though, raises a very frequent problem I see in this dialogue, and that's that it begins by asking, what can we as consumers do? And in fact, consumers are not the preponderant solution. It's not actually our choices in the marketplace that will drive change as quickly as it's needed. It is important, and we should be aware of what our clothes are made of, where they are manufactured, whether the labor conditions are fair, whether the prices we pay are sustainable, or whether they're contributing to the rush of super fast fashion, which is now dominating the global marketplace. All of those things are important, and consumers have a role. We can wear less clothing, we can keep our clothes longer, we can shop more conscionably, but that's not ultimately the driver of change. This is a global market, and governments and industry have a preponderant role in shaping how this market will achieve sustainable development. So when people ask me, what do you mean by sustainable fashion? I point to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and their targets, which were negotiated and agreed by all member states of the planet. All member states of the United Nations have come together around the SDGs, and they have metrics embedded in them so we can measure whether we're moving towards sustainability or away from it. And unfortunately, in the fashion world, we are not moving towards sustainability. We're moving further and further away from what we need to do.
So this drills down in education of decision makers, right? Can possibly help to change public policy. What are the strategies? What are the approaches that you believe are really effective in achieving the goals, the SDGs? Because as you say, everyone gather around the SDGs, but do we find that COP 27, 28, 29, whatever, actually achieved something beyond a big buzzword?
Well, that's a very important question, and the UN meetings, the conventions such as the Climate Change Convention, the COPs that you just mentioned, there is skepticism on how effective they've been. I mean, we've seen, for example, that although at the last climate change COP, governments pledged to decarbonize their economies, at the same time, report has just come out that the G20 countries, the industrialized countries of the world, are not achieving the goal of disinvestment in petroleum and natural gas. They're in fact accelerating their investment. So how can we be claiming to be decarbonizing when we're in fact hundreds of billions of dollars, including from institutions like the World Bank, are going into building the infrastructure for more drilling, more refineries, more export of natural gas and petroleum? It's a contradiction. And so there is reason for skepticism. But on the other side, there's also reason for hope, because we can use the international fora to inform decision makers and achieve a kind of ascent to developing the tools, the guidance, and eventually the regulations, which will take products that are harmful to us and to the planet off the market. And one of these tools that I'm quite interested in is the development of international sustainability standards. The climate community, looking at the risk to industry from the risk to investors from climate effects, the harmful effects on the planet. This has led to a burgeoning new industry where climate disclosure has become part of the package of what a corporation must do if it wants to continue to access capital for investment. And so these movements, International Sustainability Standards Board, for example, which has released its methodology for companies to report on their carbon emissions, these tools will eventually shape the way capital flows to and from companies that want to be in business. And it's famously been said that if your company is not carbon neutral by 2050, you will no longer be in business. So there's something on the horizon, a coalition built around sustainability standards. The European Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is another example of this, driving companies, 50,000 EU-based companies, into making reports on their impacts and the risks, impacts to the environment and their risks to their corporate bottom line if they don't manage those sustainably. So those are a few tools. We can use the fora, such as the COPs. We can use the research that's growing because of the demand to know and understand better how our behaviors affect the planet. And we can use our own advocacy community to help bring this issue to the attention not only of consumers, but to the attention of decision makers, lawmakers, who can eventually craft the kind of laws and countries that we need to live under.
Do you think that policymakers have enough information, enough participation from all stakeholders in order for them to deliberate on efficient public policy? I understand that you say we need, I do agree, but do people actually have the tools and the space to come together and offer their personal direct contribution? Because as we say,
the policies are there, but the, let's say, distribution of the knowledge and the willingness, the political will to act on that knowledge is not as strong as it needs to be.
What do you think is the issue?
I come back to my experience both as a local stakeholder in California with the Santa Clara Basin Watershed Management Initiative, where the municipalities, the county, the regional water board, the state water board, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and stakeholder groups got together to try to find a vision and eventually a watershed management plan for the Silicon Valley region. That's a region with 14 streams and nearly 2 million people impacted in the lower South San Francisco Bay catchment. So Silicon Valley decided a quarter of a century ago that it needed to manage its waterways and its portion of the San Francisco Bay sustainably. But the challenge there was that government, particularly from the capital or from Washington, D.C., even further away, simply doesn't have the knowledge, the familiarity, the intimacy needed to bring knowledge to the table to create policy. And the remedy was to create multi-stakeholder fora, several, principally one that I was involved in for more than 5 years, to craft and shape decision makers' knowledge through dialogue, through joint studies, through visioning jointly with the multi-stakeholder community what was needed. Scaling this up, the same dynamic is at play with the implementation of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The advocates of the convention have realized that, as has the Convention on Biological Diversity, both climate change and biological diversity, biodiversity, realize that in order to properly manage and implement their instruments, they need local knowledge, which I learned in 2 regions, in California, in the Santa Clara Basin Watershed Management Initiative, and more broadly in the Danube Basin, when we helped governments negotiate the Danube Environmental Protection Treaty in 1994. And in these 2 instances, the capitals, the governments, the ministries of foreign affairs and environment often lacked the intimate knowledge needed to manage the resources that were being protected, in this case, a river basin or a estuary and its 14 tributaries, the watersheds of these 2 great regions. And to remedy that, they created multi-stakeholder fora. And these fora delivered concrete benefits: pollution protection plans, watershed management plans, and a global, or rather international, treaty between the states sharing the Danube River. So these are examples that are now being absorbed by the multilateral instruments on biodiversity and climate change. And recently, the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity and the parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change have adopted resolutions and measures to ensure that local knowledge and indigenous peoples' knowledge is marshaled to support the objectives of these 2 treaties. So this is quite a new push. It was in December of 2022 that the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity adopted the Global Biodiversity Framework, and this framework from 2022 makes this need to harvest and to engage with local knowledge a premier theme of how we will achieve biodiversity and sustainability in the future.
So, togetherness, collaboration, partnerships, and forum. What is the role of technological innovation?
Well, underlying the multi-stakeholder processes that I've engaged with and that I support is really a robust democratic culture, a culture that is open to not only public participation, but to public access to information so that the public stakeholders can be informed and make decisions or campaign for actions that are supported by the information that flows. And coming to your question, the digital age has taught us that access to information requires a range of tools, not only internet, not only chats and podcasts, but also new technologies like geographic information systems, which help communities visualize where there are environmental problems, where there are challenges, where they are located. I mean, often when I started doing this work on hazardous chemicals 35 years ago, we simply didn't have access to the information that would tell us where the problems were. It was through the United States Superfund program that we finally got access to maps that were held in public offices but hidden away. I mean, literally, I had traveled to Oakland, California, to the office, the regional office of the State Water Resources Control Board, and found maps in a box that had been developed by an intern, which showed where in Silicon Valley there were toxic groundwater contaminants, Superfund sites, among the most polluted chemical sites in the nation. But in those days, this would be in the early 1990s or late 1990s, there weren't geographic information systems or online mapping of pollution. And so the public simply didn't know. I didn't know. My family didn't know. We lived on top of the confluence of two Superfund sites, and chemicals were bubbling up from the ground into the neighborhoods where my small children were schooled and where we lived. I was shocked. And I am an educated public policy advocate. I had even studied Superfund as a graduate student and as a young researcher in an academy, and yet I didn't know what was happening in my own backyard. So that's a quarter of a century ago. Today, we have access to this information under instruments like the Aarhus Convention or Community Right to Know Act in the United States. We have GIS and digital mapping, so we can visualize it and we can share that information with our fellow members of our community, and we can act on that information by demanding, in this case, the cleanup or the cessation of the pollution that is such a problem.
Yeah, definitely. If you can give a suggestion for every individual to contribute to a more sustainable future, what would you suggest?
I'm a believer, in spite of my history of working internationally, I think it really has to start at the community level. People need to talk to their neighbors. They need to talk to the community's leaders. They need to understand where they are, where there are problems, weaknesses, unsustainable practices, and start by addressing those. In my life, that's where I started. I started protesting a cement factory in my neighborhood, and I knew about that pollution because I had to wash the car from the cement kiln dust that would layer it periodically with a thin pollutant. And I joined with other students, and we joined eventually with local leaders And now that factory is being decommissioned. And it takes a long time sometimes to achieve a result. Um, but that local networking was invaluable in my history of learning how to be an effective citizen, how to be an effective advocate. And once you
So,
have that experience, then you can scale it up. You can apply it to other decision-making fora. It's amazing what a small group of influential people can do when they're empowered with knowledge. But I really have seen that in my lifetime. We've had success, for example, in getting certain pollutants taken out of the market, banned from impregnating children's clothing with certain flame retardants that are forever chemicals, and so on. So it's a lifetime commitment, I suppose, but it's effective. It doesn't have to be your entire life, doesn't have to be your career, but I would start at the community level.
so community first, and then influencing decision maker, and finally come to policy that can frame everyone's action. Was that your recipe?
I suppose that is my recipe. And just to flip it, I've seen too many um, professionals who jump straight into, let's say, the national arena. They set their sights on a career in ministry, for example, and they get caught up at this very abstract and distant level from the problems that they hope to solve. They cut themselves off from sources of truth, of information, of knowledge that's generated locally, and they end up getting everything through a derivative source, and it's not as impactful. I've I can mention countless people who felt disempowered after a career in a bureaucracy, cut off from their communities. So that's the opposite of what I'm recommending. I really would start by building your relationship with your own home, your own community, your neighbors, your townships, and working up from there through coalitions and stakeholder activities.
Do you think that companies can be the ecosystem where individuals get educated around values that then can drive the community towards a positive action for everyone?
I do. If the companies are open and talk with their neighbors and stakeholders, the Santa Clara Basin Watershed Management Initiative had 35 signatory groups, including major industries like Agilent, a spinoff of Hewlett Packard, IBM, these major high tech, important companies in the lower South San Francisco Bay area. And those representatives sat with Green Group members, Clean South Bay, Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, Audubon Society, and with other community organizations, League of Women Voters, for example, Sierra Club. And they exchanged views over a period of years and learned from each other what could be done, what was priority, what was feasible, and use that knowledge to inform decision makers, that is, public elected officials, city councils, regional water boards, and so on. They became effective advocates because they first listened to each other. So that's a good example of good practice done by corporations that wanted to get past the classical conflicts between business and green groups. That got us nowhere, let's say. Um, Sometimes conflict is inevitable, but to really move beyond that and create the sharing of information between these different stakeholders provided the key that gave public decision makers, elected officials, the courage then to follow through on some of these actions.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really important what you just said, collaboration and
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into today's episode of the Green Truth podcast. We hope you found our discussion enlightening and inspiring. Remember, it's through understanding truth and action that we can pave the way for a sustainable future. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe for more thought-provoking conversations, and don't forget to leave us a review. Until next time, stay curious and keep seeking the truth.